इंद्रप्रस्थ ये इंद्रप्रस्थ,
हर युग का ये भारत दर्शन, हर युग का ये भारत दर्शन, हर युग का ये भारत
ये
दर्शन।
इंद्रप्रस्थ ये इंद्रप्रस्थ, ये इंद्रप्रस्थ ये इंद्रप्रस्थ, ये इंद्रप्रस्थ ये इंद्रप्रस्थ।
Welcome to Indraprastha.
The capital of the world's oldest, largest, and most vibrant civilization and democracy.
Where eminent experts unfold the past, present, and future towards building a greater Bharat, Mahabharat.
An initiative of Neera Misra's Draupadi Dream Trust,
Ranjit Chaturvedi's Project AatmaNirbhar,
And Aryan Aditya from Crisol's Media. A great privilege welcoming Dr. Bibek Debroy. Dr. Bibek Debroy is an eminent economist and a great Sanskrit scholar.
he is currently serving as the chairman of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister of India.
He has also translated the Bhagavad Gita, the Harivamsha, the Vedas, and Rishi Valmiki's Ramayana in English. He has also translated the Bhagavad Purana and the Markandeya Purana.
He was awarded Padma Shri in 2015 and was conferred the title of Vachaspati by the Sri Lal Bahadur Shastri Rashtriya Sanskrit Vidyapeeth in 2018.
The topic for today is Indraprastha as the symbol of the AatmaNirbhar Bharat from Dwapar Yug till Kalyug. Namaskar, good morning. A very hearty welcome to Dr. Bibek Debroy, whom I fondly call Bibek Da.
नमस्कार डॉक्टर देबरॉय और एंड लविंगली बिबेक दा।
आप सभी को प्रणाम। आपका स्वागत है इस सेशन में। डॉक्टर बिबेक देबरॉय, आपको प्रणाम। स्पेशली हमारा आपका एक कनेक्शन है कॉमन, पीएचडी चेंबर ऑफ कॉमर्स एंड इंडस्ट्री, जहां पर आई हैव बीन an elected member and I've also been the chairman of the Africa Committee, the Middle East Committee, co-chairman of the UP Committee, and I also run a social media network by the name of Project AatmaNirbhar. It started at the same time as the Prime Minister last year spoke about AatmaNirbharta, and there's a lot that we've been doing under that.
Thank you and good morning. Indeed, I have a long association with Neera Mishra and the Draupadi Trust, and it is impossible to say no to her because those who know her know of her ability to dictate. So Neera Mishra not only dictates saying that you have to speak, she also gives you the topic. And she has made it a most difficult topic for me because it says Indraprastha, which is okay. But then it also says make in India. And it also says Dwapar to Kalyug. Had it been simply Indraprastha, it would have been easier to speak about, but now she wants me to bring in Make in India into it, and she wants me to bring in Dwapar Yug to Kali Yug also into it. So I will try and weave these various strands together. You are welcome to ask me questions, but that does not necessarily mean that I have the answers. Several of the questions are questions that I will raise, and these are questions that we should collectively probe and explore. Because what we are talking about is part of our legacy. I think anyone who's interested in Indraprastha, and I'm particularly talking about listeners, viewers who are not familiar with the work done by the Draupadi Trust, should take a look at 2 volumes that the Draupadi Trust brought out. And that was called, if my memory serves me right, Mahabharat Manthan. Mahabharat Manthan has a specific essay on Indraprastha. Mahabharat Manthan has a specific essay on Indraprastha. I have nothing against Western scholars. Western scholars are welcome to write about our legacy. Indeed, they have made phenomenal contributions to our legacy. But what I found somewhat bemusing about this essay on Indraprastha that has been authored in that 2-volume collection called Mahabharat Manthan is that this was an essay authored by a foreign scholar. I would like an Indian scholar, I would like an Indian viewer or listener who's listening in to explore Indraprastha specifically and write about Indraprastha. It is for people who are watching and listening to do that research, to write that stuff. It's not for Neera Mishra and me to do it. We are too old to do that. One of the reasons why I am here, apart from Neera Mishra being very affectionate towards me, is because I translated the Mahabharata into English. Whenever it is mentioned that I've translated the Mahabharata into English, sometimes people ask, why did you decide to do that? Aren't there plenty of translations of the Mahabharata already floating around in English? The answer is not really. What you see floating around in English normally are abridged translations. There are only 3 unabridged translations of the Mahabharata in English, only 3. The first 2 were done by Kishori Mohan Ganguly and Manmatha Nath Datta towards the end of the 19th century, and the third one is the one that I have done. The one that I have done is in 10 volumes and it runs into 2.25 million words, which illustrates the huge mammoth size of the Mahabharata. The translation that I did is on the basis of what is known as the critical edition of the Mahabharata. The critical edition of the Mahabharata essentially sifted through many of the versions of the Mahabharata that were floating around in Sanskrit in India. There were more than 1200 of those. Tried to sift out and try and identify to the extent that it is possible what was or may have been the original. The critical edition has been criticized sometimes on grounds of omission of certain shlokas, but it was a phenomenal task done by the Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute between 1916 and 1966. It was 50 years. People have criticized it, but it was a phenomenal task. Criticism is always easy. There is that famous story about a painter who painted a picture on a pavement and left a piece of chalk saying, whoever has any criticisms, please criticize. So every passerby came along and used that piece of chalk to criticize that painting. Next day, the same painter turned up, placed the chalk. The pavement was blank and said, draw your picture. Not a single one volunteered. So it's a little bit like that. And now that I'm translating the Puranas, one of the things that's lacking is, across Puranas, there have been experimental attempts at pilot stages for some Puranas, but across Puranas, is there a critical edition? No, there isn't. So people who criticize Bhandarkar, by all means criticize, by why don't you come along and do a critical edition yourselves of one of the Puranas? That's constructive criticism. But anyway, the reason I mention this is my familiarity with the Mahabharata is therefore based on the critical edition. And when one talks about perceptions about the Mahabharata, There are perceptions which are based on non-Sanskrit renderings of the Mahabharata. Those are equally important. But whatever I will say is primarily based on the critical edition. What do we find about Indraprastha in the critical edition? Not very much. We find much more about Hastinapur, which was the traditional capital. Indraprastha was the new capital. Hastinapur was the old capital, the city of elephants, which is why it is sometimes referred to as Gajasavya or Nagasavya, elephants. Indraprastha was the new one. And the story goes, not quite in the critical edition, but the story goes that the Pandavas asked for 5 villages. The Mahabharata does not give the names of those 5 villages. But our source of information, including for my bio these days, is often Wikipedia. See, if I look up Wikipedia, I will actually find the names of the 5 villages. The Mahabharata doesn't mention the names of those 5 villages, at least the critical edition does not. But Wikipedia will give me the names of those 5 villages. And what are the names of these 5 villages? They are Indraprastha, which is Delhi today, sort of. Swarnaprastha, which is Sonipat. Panaprastha, which is Panipat. Vyaghraprastha, which is Bagpat. And Tilaprastha, which is Tilpat. Wikipedia is not always wrong. But all I'm saying is the Mahabharata does not say any such thing. What does the Mahabharata tell us? The Mahabharata tells us that the forest of Khandava was cleared up. The forest of Khandava was cleared up, the forest was burned down, there was Khandav Dahan, and the Pandavas created a capital, a new capital there. To me, what this suggests is urbanization. Clearing up of a forest for urbanization. So Indraprastha to me was urbanization. That's what it really represents. Where was Indraprastha? We don't quite know, at least not enough research has been done. The word Indraprastha means a place where Indra presides, where Indra is the ruling divinity, where Indra is the ruling deity. The expanse where Indra is. Why was it called Indraprastha? I'm jumping the gun a little bit, but the architect of the Asuras, the architect of the Danavas, Maya, was asked to create this new city. And he modeled it on Indra's city, which is why it came to be called Indraprastha. Delhi is a very, very old city. There were layers in Delhi. There were several stages of urbanization in Delhi. Not that all of those centers of urbanization were exactly in the same place. Today, if I look at the geography of Delhi, those habitations, those cities were in different places, but they're all in what is today regarded as Delhi. And there is one part of Delhi which is Purana Killa. One of the oldest layers of that civilization. And the Archaeological Survey of India tells us, not Wikipedia, the Archaeological Survey of India tells us that till the year 1913, 1913, there used to be a village called Indrapat there. till 1993, within the Purana Killa fort, there used to be a village called Indraprastha. One of the unfortunate bits about probing our history, our legacy, is that not enough has been done about archaeological excavations. To the extent archaeological excavations have been done in the Purana Killa region, and I'm not an archaeologist, so do correct me if I'm wrong, we have traces of painted greyware which date back to about 1500 BCE. So if we put those two bits of information together, it seems to be a reasonable proposition that there was indeed an urbanized settlement called Indrapat or Indraprastha, dating back to around 1500 BCE. In other words, it confirms what the Mahabharata tells us, with a question mark about the date that I will come back to. And all of this is depicted in the Sabha Parva of the Mahabharata. Notice one remarkable fact. Indraprastha figures prominently in Khandav Dahan. Indraprastha figures prominently in terms of it being the capital of the Pandavas. After the Kurukshetra war is over, what happens to Indraprastha? According to the Mahabharata, after the Kurukshetra war is over, we are not particularly interested in Indraprastha anymore. We know that Parikshit ruled in Hastinapur, the old capital. Who ruled in Indraprastha? Vajra, of no great consequence. Of course, Vajra was Aniruddha's son, Krishna's descendant. But we are not given any particular information about Vajra. One of the most difficult issues to confront, and this is extremely controversial, is the dating of the Mahabharata and the dating of the Kurukshetra war. And therefore the dating of the advent of Kali Yuga. And Neera Mishra asked me to talk about Dwapar Yug to Kali Yug. Most of the events of the Mahabharata occur in Dwapar Yug, but towards the end, after Krishna's death, we step into Kali Yug. So at one level, we have to grapple about the dating of the Mahabharata or the Kurukshetra war. An extremely controversial area where people's blood pressures go up. One way of dating is to purely use astronomical calculations. And traditional datings, whether it is of 3102 BCE or 2559 BCE, are based on astronomical calculations. I have several problems with these astronomical calculations, so let me state some of these. We know that the Mahabharata was not composed at one point in time. Vedavyasa composed an original to which there were later and later additions. Stated very simplistically, there was a Jaya, which became a Bharata, which became a Mahabharata. And this entire process probably took 1000 years. Over a period of 1000 years, astronomical positions will have changed. There will have been precession of the equinoxes. Today, when I look at the text of the Mahabharata, do I know whether a reference goes back to 500 BCE or does it go back to 500 CE? I don't really know. There were parts of India that followed a lunar calendar. There were parts of India that followed a solar calendar. There were parts of India that followed a lunar calendar where the month began with Purnima. There were parts of India which followed a lunar calendar where the months began with Amavasya. Everyone who has done an astronomical calculation points to a shloka, but note the shloka is never unambiguous. I have to interpret it with some subjectivity. There is a word which is subject to my interpretation. And that interpretation may or may not be true. But most important of all, for me, an astronomical calculation based only on the text is not good enough unless it is validated by other sources. What kind of sources? Well, for example, geology. We know according to the text that the river Saraswati dried up by around 2000 BCE or thereabouts. By the time the Mahabharata war happens, the Saraswati had already dried up. If the Saraswati dried up around 2000 BCE or earlier, then how can we have a date for the Mahabharata war, for the Kurukshetra war, that predates 2000 BC? We know that the Yamuna changed flow. It used to flow westwards, it began to flow eastwards. So I have the geological evidence. I have the evidence about the evolution of Sanskrit as a language. I have the archaeological evidence. Perhaps not that much for Indraprastha and Purana Killa, but I have a lot of archaeological evidence for Kampilya, for Ahichatra, for Dwarka. I have DNA evidence. And I have the genealogical lists from the Puranas which date, give precise dates from the crowning of Parikshit to the time of Mahapadmananda, which depending on the Purana is given as 1050 years or 1015 words. To put all of this together, if I validate it with external data, not just astronomy, and I repeat, what I'm about to say upsets a lot of people because they base their calculations only on the astronomical data. I would say that the Kurukshetra war happened around 1500 BC. Give or take a couple of 100 years on either side. My benchmark will be 1500 BC. And remember what I said about the painted grey ware, 1500 BC. Datings of the Iron Age in India go back to about 1800 BC. So just park that year 1500 BC. In terms of urbanization, the texts tell us about the 16 Mahajanapadas. That was another phase of urbanization in India. In the list of 16 Mahajanapadas, you will not find Indraprastha mentioned. It's not one of the 16 Mahajanapadas. To what timeline do we ascribe the 16 Mahajanapadas? Roughly 500 BC onwards. So if I put those two bits of evidence together, I have one depiction of urbanization 1500 BC, I have another depiction of urbanization, 500 BC. 1000 years in between, I don't know what happened. What happened to urbanization in India between those 1000 years, roughly 1500 BCE and 500 BC? One of the mysteries, it's not really a mystery, it is a mystery only in terms of the way history is taught in India, is the integration of the Indus-Saraswati civilization. The so-called Aryan invasion theory is rubbish. Although people continue to propagate it, they've just changed it from Aryan invasion to Aryan immigration. It has been conclusively established by all kinds of research, including the DNA research, that there was no sudden discontinuity between Indus-Saraswati civilization, the people who inhabited that, and the subsequent Indians, so to speak, subsequent Bharatiyas, the same DNA. I need not point out, but maybe I should, is that the Indus-Saraswati civilization represented a fantastic level of urbanization and urban planning. And what was the time span for the Indus-Saraswati civilization? And I'm not talking about Mohenjo-daro, Harappa alone. I'm talking about even places like Dholavira, because the geographical expanse was far, far more than Mohenjo-daro, Harappa. About 3300 to 1300 BC, with a peak period around 2600 to 1900 BC. Question to ask: what happened to the Indus-Saraswati civilization? Where did it go? If it was not decimated by Aryans, then what happened to it? I think the answer is very simple. The civilization simply moved eastwards. The Saraswati river dried up. The Yamuna changed direction. There were environmental causes. So the civilization did not vanish, regardless of whether we are able to decipher the script or not. It just moved eastwards. Let me give you one example of this. Where is or where was Magad? Almost everyone will say Magad was in Bihar. So before Narendra Modi became the Prime Minister, he made a speech about Alexander the Great and about Alexander the Great coming up to Magad. And immediately all the historians jumped up and down and said, stuff and nonsense. Here is the would-be Prime Minister who doesn't know anything about history. Of course, we believe history only if that history comes from the West. And what does the famous historian Plutarch tell us? The famous historian Plutarch tells us that Alexander reached the borders of Magad. It's very strange. Alexander reached the borders of Magad. Magad is supposed to be Bihar. Recently, I read two very interesting books. One is a book by someone named Ranajit Pal. Both are recent books. Ranajit Pal has published a book called The Krishna Bharata War, where he says that he has deciphered some of the Indus Valley scripts. And he says one of those scripts, or bunch of scripts, refers to the word Magad. I read another interesting book by Sai Papineni called Hymns of Harappa, where he has argued that many of the places that we now identify as geographical places in India now were places that were westwards part of the Indus-Saraswati civilization. What is the simple point that I am trying to make? Magad may be Bihar today, but Magad may not have been Bihar then. There may very well have been a Magad in the Indus-Saraswati civilization. It is a perfectly normal tendency for humans when they move to a new settlement to name cities and habitations following the names of older cities. So people from Britain, when they moved to the United States, they gave cities names that were very similar to the names on the other side of the Atlantic. So you have a Cambridge there, you have a Cambridge here. Exactly similarly, it could very well have been a Magad in the Saraswati civilization, and there are several examples of such cities, and it simply moved eastwards. Where did the urbanization go? 1500 BC, one phase of urbanization. 500 BC, another phase of urbanization. What happened for 1000 years? I gave you a date of around 1500 BC for the Kurukshetra war. Now think of it for 1 minute. No one is suggesting that the scale of that Kurukshetra war was necessarily the way it is depicted in the Mahabharata today. Obviously, there are exaggerations. But if a war on this scale happened, even if one reduces the impact because of exaggerations, if a war on that scale happens involving every kingdom in Bharat that he could think of, it would have set back everything for a very, very long period of time. It would have set back urbanization for a very long period of time. It would have set back advancement in knowledge for a very, very long period of time. It would have set back technological advances for a very, very long period of time. So if we think out of the box, it does not seem to me to be a very inconceivable proposition that there was indeed a large war with massive devastation which set back urbanization for roughly 1000 years, between 1500 BC and 500 BC. Notice that we are also talking about technology. And we loosely use the word Deva and we translated it into English as God. The word Deva does not mean God. Or not God as in the way we understand it. Deva means the shining one, the resplendent one, which is the reason the sun is called Divakara, because it gives us the day. Devas, as depicted in our texts, were simply superior to human beings. They were not gods in that sense. In the famous Nala Damayanti story of the Mahabharata, the four guardians of the four directions, Yama, Varuna, Mitra, Indra, they come disguised as Nalas to persuade Damayanti to marry them. Of course, Damayanti recognizes that they are devas, not humans, because they do not sweat, etc., etc. So the devas and rishis in our Itihas Purana tradition are also subjected to birth and destruction. Think of all the wonderful technology, the Vimanas, the Divyastras. To me, if we begin to argue about whether human beings possess that technology, I think it does violence to what the texts tell us. The texts never tell us that human beings possess this technology. Every Vimana you will be able to think of, every Divastra that you will be able to think of came from Devas or Rishis. They were constructed by the likes of Maya and Vishwakarma. So the Deva civilization, whatever it was slightly distinct from the human civilization or the Manav civilization. And to put it in colorful trade terms, it was like a relatively less advanced agricultural civilization offering charu and primary products to Devas and getting back advanced technology and know-how like from the developed countries, insofar as it is described by the texts. Where did this technology disappear, the Maya and the Vishwakarma, if this technology existed? I will make only one point. According to the United Nations, there is an estimate of the total number of books published in any language in the world since the beginning of Gutenberg's printing press. That estimate is around 130 million, roughly. There is something called Namami, the National Manuscript Mission, which is in the business of collating and listing our manuscripts, defined as texts, puthis, which are more than 75 years old. And I'm not even talking about a whole lot of knowledge that was passed down through oral transmission. Namami estimates, remember the 130 million, Namami is still in early days, but there are estimates based on Namami which say that the number of manuscripts in India is 40 million. 40 million and 130 million. The point to note is that about 95% of these texts have not even been translated. If those texts have not been translated, how do we know what is in them? Before we dismiss them, at least let us translate them, understand them, read them before we dismiss them without even looking at them. If we dismiss them, that is not science. That is not an empirical lens. The manuscript of Arthashastra, which everyone quotes now, had completely disappeared until Shama Shastri discovered it in 1905. As an economist and historical time series, most economists talk about Walter Madison and Walter Madison's figures on per capita income in India. And if one goes by Walter Madison's figures, the per capita income in India then wasn't remarkably different from the per capita income in Western Europe, other parts of the world. We were on par, and this continued for a very, very long time. The differential began to creep in at the time of the Industrial Revolution. That's when the real difference started to make its presence felt. In terms of a governance template, because after all, the question to ask is what determines make in India. In terms of the governance template, our texts describe a template that is very different from capitalism, which caricatured means dependence on the market, and very different from socialism, caricatured by a dependence completely on the state. Our governance template has a role for the state, in fact, a limited role for the state. The best example of that is the story of Prithu, the first king, after which Prithvi is named Prithvi, after whom. There's a template with a limited role for the state government, for the state, limited role for the market, and a whole lot done by the community. There was no Competition Commission of India. That stuff was done by the Srenis. There was no MRP. That was done for the Sreni by the Srenis. And one of the things that is not explored enough is the remarkable governance template, the administrative template that was set up as depicted in Arthashastra. And Arthashastra is just one of the Arthashastra texts. There are many other Arthashastra texts. The Mahabharata itself has depictions of Arthashastra and Rajadharma. And that template of what householders are also supposed to do and what communities are also supposed to do. As a result of that, there were temples, which were not just temples. Those temples were also examples of dissemination of education, of health services, of governance. The Industrial Revolution was largely driven by spread of education. So if one is talking about Kali Yuga and the image of Kalki, to me, the problems really started with the collapse of that governance template that we were familiar with and the stop of the dissemination of information. The Industrial Revolution was not created by large bodies. They were all individuals, small individuals, in direct correlation with spread of education. To paraphrase Swami Vivekananda a little bit, human societies, he didn't exactly say that, he could have said it, human societies, human civilizations also go through Satya, Rajas, Tamas cycles. The so-called Satya Yuga was a predominant emphasis, had a predominant emphasis on Satya Guna. Dwapar Yuga, which Nira Mishra forced me to recognize in the title, is Rajas and Tamas. Kali Yuga is Tamas. To ensure make in India, we need to rediscover not Satya Guna. We need to rediscover Rajas, the passion, the enterprise, the drive, the entrepreneurship, which was a characteristic of Indian governance and development for many, many years. I've spoken much longer than I should have. Thank you very, very much.
Could it be that due to this role, Krishna's role, because Krishna ने यमुना से शादी भी पहली बार इंद्रप्रस्थ में ही की थी, यमुना के तट पर दिल्ली में जो आज है, and all of this coming together, सर इसमें यमुना को हम क्यों इग्नोर करते हैं और क्यों, जिस तरह से सरस्वती और वेद, सरस्वती ब्रह्मा का कनेक्शन है, उसी प्रकार से यमुना और कृष्ण और ब्रज. तो इसमें से एक मेरी रिक्वेस्ट है कि यमुना पे अगर थोड़ा सा भी आपका समय यमुना पे चला जाए तो वो हमारे लिए एक एहसान होगा, यमुना भक्तों के लिए.
देखिए ऐसा है, आज तो समय नहीं है.
नहीं सब फ्यूचर के लिए.
तो आप जो कह रहे हो वो हो सकता है इंद्रप्रस्थ में भी may have been an area rather than anything else. मगर एक चीज मैं कहना चाहूंगा जो महाभारत में नहीं है, जो हरिवंश में है, which actually talks about Balaram using his plow to drag the Yamuna.
जी, वो जगह है मथुरा में.
So, which actually indicates that the Yamuna did change course. That is that statement taken literally really indicates that the Yamuna actually changed course, which is also proved by some geological explorations. तो मैं आपसे सहमत हूं, दोबारा मुझे बुलाइएगा.
दूसरा सर, एक
आप बुलाइएगा, नीरा मिश्रा को कहिएगा.
यमुना बुलाएगी सर, यमुना और नीरा जी बुलाएंगी. दूसरा सर, एक आपने युगों की बात कही, चारों युगों की. सर क्या हम डेली चारों युग नहीं जीते हर 24 घंटे में?
ये तो सवाल नहीं है, इसको कमेंट करके छोड़ देते हैं क्योंकि उनको भी एक मौका देना चाहिए ना.
ओके प्लीज.
अच्छा सर, क्विकली मेरे पास बहुत सारे सवाल थे, स्पेशली ऑन क्राफ्ट्समैनशिप, स्किल डेवलपमेंट, टेक्नोलॉजी, पॉलिसी एंड ट्रेनिंग, बट आई विल आस्क अ वेरी क्विक क्वेश्चन. सर, what is the scope of combining together all difference, taking out all differences and countering the Western narratives through which we have been understanding history? हम कैसे एकत्र होकर उस वेस्टर्न नैरेटिव्स को काउंटर कर सकते हैं?
I think the answer really is on us, because we need to set the agenda. We are perpetually reacting, we are perpetually complaining. To me, it is no good saying that X author has said this, Y author has said this, and abusing that person on social media, which is fine. But that is not a good enough narrative until we begin to set our own narrative. और ये जो करना है ना, ये सरकार की जिम्मेदारी नहीं है, या सिर्फ सरकार की जिम्मेदारी नहीं है. It devolves on us. So the question to ask is, as an individual, what am I doing to correct that narrative? All those are comments, so it's 12:30. Let me go.
Okay, thank you so very much. We'll send you the questions and we'll invite you again for only question answer session.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
इंद्रप्रस्थ जय इंद्रप्रस्थ जय इंद्रप्रस्थ जय इंद्रप्रस्थ.
हर युग का ये भारत दर्शन, हर युग का ये भारत दर्शन, हर युग का ये भारत
जय
दर्शन.
इंद्रप्रस्थ जय इंद्रप्रस्थ जय इंद्रप्रस्थ जय इंद्रप्रस्थ जय इंद्रप्रस्थ जय इंद्रप्रस्थ.
Welcome to Indraprastha.
The capital of the world's oldest, largest, and most vibrant civilization and democracy.
where eminent experts unfold the past, present, and future towards building a greater Bharat, Mahabharat.
An initiative of Neera Misra's Draupadi Dream Trust,
Ranjit Chaturvedi's Project AatmaNirbhar.
And Aryan Aditya from Crisol's Media.